Hello everybody, welcome back to the Lab Live Lit Lab. We are learning how to be better readers here, and I have questions for you. Have you ever read a book and run into a character that you really, really love? Right? It just, every time you see them on the page, you're happy. Or the converse, a character you really hate, right? You read the book and you get to the villain or the obstreperous bureaucrat or something, you go, oh, I hate that guy. Or a character maybe that you identify with, right? You see yourself in them. And when you read that, you feel like, this story is capturing somehow something of my life. Well, that is characterization, and that is the topic of our video today. When you read, you're going to run into characters, regardless of what kind of story you're reading. And one really good thing to know how to do is to talk about characterization, right? Because when you go out to your salons or your book clubs or your coffee clatches or wherever you're going, and you say, oh, I really like this character, your friends are going to say, really, why? What did you like about them? And if you haven't really thought about characterization, if you haven't really been mindful of what the author is doing in order to make the character who they are, then you're just going to sit there and just go, they're kind of cool, right? You don't want to do that. No, you want to talk intelligently. So let's do that. We're going to talk about different types of characterization and things to look out for as you are reading, right? So let's go. So in the simplest terms, there are basically two types of characterization in stories, direct and indirect. And it's useful to be able to identify which is which. So direct characterization, the narrative itself tells us who the character is, right? Or maybe even the character itself will tell you who they are. So I went and I dug through Frankenstein because I had the books to hand when I was writing the script for this. And it's a useful one. So, for example, Victor tells us in chapter 2, he says, I was capable of a more intense application and was more deeply smitten with the thirst for knowledge. So there we go. That's Victor Frankenstein telling us, the reader, who he is. Easy, simple. So we know, all right, great. Victor really wants to know things. He's really interested in learning more about the world. Fantastic. The creature, right? When we see the creature described in chapter 5, he is described thusly. His yellow skin scarcely covered the work of muscles and arteries beneath. His hair was of a lustrous black and flowing, his teeth of a pearly whiteness, but these luxuriances only formed a more horrid contrast with his watery eyes that seemed almost the same color as the dun white sockets in which they were set, his shriveled complexion, and straight black lips. So that's a good example, actually, a really good example of what direct characterization often does, is it'll tell us what a character looks like, right? It's kind of hard to, well, not hard, but very often when an author wants to establish the appearance of a character, they're going to use direct characterization. They're going to show us what their hair color is, or skin color is, or eye color is, if they're tall or short or big or small, whatever. So that's always good. So when you're reading, whenever you notice a thing about, this is what the character looks like, that's direct characterization. And it's interesting to see like what kind of authors will tell you a lot about what they look like. So Mary Shelley really wanted us to know what the creature looked like. It was very important to her that we know that the creature was built to be beautiful, right? The creature was built to be as pretty as Victor could make it. However, he wasn't. Something had gone wrong. Something had gone weird. Maybe it's because the creature was a thing that never should have existed, but the creature is not beautiful. All right, there's direct characterization again. Let's do one more, right? Elizabeth Lavenza, the kind of sister, but not quite sister, and wife, briefly, of Victor Frankenstein. We hear this in chapter 1. Her person was the image of her mind. Her hazel eyes, although as lively as a bird's, possessed an attractive softness. Her figure was light and airy, and though capable of enduring great fatigue, she appeared the most fragile creature in the world. So there we go. That is our direct characterization of Elizabeth, right? We know what she looks like. We know that she has a certain delicacy to her, that even though she is capable of working hard and keeping up, she looks like she should break in a minute. So yeah, that is direct characterization. It's usually fairly easy to spot, and very often it is telling us kind of the obvious stuff about the character, right? The surface level stuff about the character, that their appearance or their basic sort of attitude and personality is going to be transmitted to us directly. And that's good because it lays sort of a foundation for us to know who they are. If you are able to picture people in your head, then you may be able to start to build a picture of who they are in your mind of what this person's like. You can already start making some predictions, perhaps, about what this person's going to do or how they're going to behave or react in certain circumstances, right? We know that Victor is very much has a thirst for knowledge, so that we know that if he's in a position where knowledge is available, of course he's going to go after that because that's how the character's been set up. So that is direct characterization. Great, good fun. Indirect characterization is slightly different, right? Indirect characterization uses the character's thoughts or their speech or their action to demonstrate the character, right? I've often said that when you are reading a book, there's a couple of ways you can find out who somebody is. And honestly, this is true about the real world too. We can know what people are by the things they say about themselves. People will often talk about themselves and say, oh, here's what I look like, here's what I act like, here's the things I enjoy. But we also know what a person is like through their behavior. We see how they act, we see how they speak, we see how they interact with the world. And when those two things, when what people say about themselves and the way they behave, when they mesh, that's great because we have a very good idea now of who this person is, for good or for ill. When they don't, then we have something really, really interesting, right? If we have, for example, a character who says, or a person, there are real people in the world this applies to. We have a person who says, oh, I hate conflict. I'm not very good at conflict. I don't like when people fight or argue. I want nothing to do with that. And then they find themselves in a state of conflict with somebody, and they suddenly become hyper competent, that they've suddenly become really good at resolving or shutting down conflict, maybe because they don't like it. But, if you had just relied on that direct characterization on what the person said about themselves, you would think that they would not be somebody you want in that kind of situation. But the way you see them behave, you see them that they're actually very good at conflict and very good at conflict resolution. So they become a more complex, rounded 3D character. Isn't that great? So let's take a look at some indirect characterization using some of the characters we've already talked about. So let's go back to Victor, right? So Victor, this is after he had built the creature. He says, I had worked hard for nearly 2 years for the sole purpose of infusing life into an inanimate body. For this, I had deprived myself of rest and health. I had desired it with an ardor that far exceeded moderation. But now that I had finished, the beauty of the dream vanished, and breathless horror and disgust filled my heart. So, this is Victor's reaction to his creature, and we learn about he's impulsive, he's obsessive. He throws everything that he has into what he is doing, but then there's that sense of regret and that sense of fear. He doesn't want to take responsibility for the creature and what he has built and what he has created, and he can't really foresee the consequences of what's about to happen, right? He made a person. He made a human being, and anybody who's had neglectful parents knows that neglectful parents aren't great, that's not a good situation. And Victor is going to be a neglectful parent. But we can see from that description where he talks about his feelings upon looking at the creature, we can already start to draw these conclusions of him. Like, great, okay. Now we have contrast and conflict, right? He wants knowledge, he wants to know things, but he is terrified of the consequences of knowledge and terrified of the consequences of what he has created. And that's going to be a problem for him. That's essentially going to be the book. So let's look at the creature. This comes after the creature has learned to read. He has found some books about politics and history. And the creature says this: I can hardly describe to you the effect of these books. They produced in me an infinity of new images and feelings that sometimes raised me to ecstasy, but more frequently sunk me into the lowest dejection. So the creature's had this emotional reaction to reading, and it shows us his development, his growing up, his awareness, right? He's becoming aware of the world. He's becoming aware of things that are beyond himself and the DeLacy family nearby, but he is sad because he's learning things that are upsetting and disturbing about people and humans and the way that the world works. And so again, we start to add that onto who the creature is. A little while later, he meets a scene that's often depicted in Frankenstein movies. he meets a little girl, and he says this. She continued her course along the precipitous river when suddenly her foot slipped, and she fell into the rapid stream. I rushed from my hiding place and, with extreme labor from the force of the current, saved her and dragged her to shore. So it's basically just a description of his actions, right? What the creature did. But it tells us that he is innately a good person, that he wants to help, at least at this point in his life. He wants to help other people. He is putting himself at risk to save this little girl. And this is part of the complexity and, frankly, the tragedy of the creature, is that in his heart, he is good. He is benevolent. He wants to be a good member of society, but he's turned into a monster by his anger and his need for vengeance and the continuing rejection of the people around him. So when we look at characters and we read about them, the author is going to tell us in different ways what kind of person they are. Very often, like I said, the really sort of obvious surface level stuff is stuff that we're going to see through direct characterization. They're going to be told to us pretty explicitly what they're going to be. The more maybe important or sort of core characteristics of a character are going to be through indirect characterization, right? And once you recognize what this is, you see it all the time. I was just reading the Kindle sample of Stephen King's book, The Institute. Look out for that video coming soon. But there's one scene where we see our sort of first main character, who is an ex-police officer. And up to this certain point in the story, he seems fairly laid back, right? He's sort of going where the world takes him at this point. But as soon as there's a crisis, you see in just one paragraph, he snaps into crisis mode. And you get a feeling of, without somebody saying, oh yeah, this guy's really competent and good at his job, you know this guy is really competent and really good at his job, right? Excellent example of indirect characterization there. So yeah, I think it's really, really useful to keep an eye on how the author demonstrates this. You might even ask yourself why, like if the author's using direct, if the author's telling us something, we might say, well, why is the author telling us directly about this quality of the character? Or if it's indirect, why is the author showing us or about this aspect of the character? Why did the author choose to do it one way or the other? Because the author can do that, right? And I think very often it's because, like I said, when you get into deeper aspects of who the character is, what makes them a person rather than simply an action figure to move through the story, that's the kind of thing that we as readers, we need to see it, right? The old adage of writing is show, don't tell, and that sometimes works. But in this case, yeah, I think if we're going to really, really connect to the character, we have to see those aspects of that character for ourselves. So that is the thing. As you are reading, keep your eye on that. Now, what kind of things might make this tricky? Well, again, different authors have different ways of doing it. Some authors are excellent at different types of characterization, and they're very, very good at creating for you sort of a whole picture of who this person is. Other characters are not, or other authors are not, I should say. Some authors don't really care about what people look like. They simply care about their core being. Some authors go into great detail about sort of the appearance and the behavior and the sound of a character and not so much about their inner life. So you kind of have to adjust author to author and book to book as you go. Also, if you're reading a story that is in first person, then you have to kind of remember as you're reading that there is a filter, right, between you and the story, and that is the storyteller. And so the narrator in that case is choosing what to tell us about the other characters in this story, right? When I read The Secret Histories, right, the first person narrator, Richard, has a lot of kind of complexes about himself and his place in his gang of classic students. And so we have to kind of understand that he's going to choose what he wants us to know. And there's stuff that he's going to leave out, or there are judgments that he's going to make that affect how we feel about those other characters. So yeah, if you're reading a first-person story, you kind of have to take that into account as well. But again, this is all good stuff to know. This is all understanding how the books work, so that next time you go to your book club or your salon or your coffee clutch and your friends say, so what did you think? Who's a character that you liked? You can say, oh, let me tell you everything about this character and why I love them. And you can go into great detail and you can show your friends just how smart you are, which is what we all aspire to do. So thank you for sticking around. Thank you for coming to class. I really appreciate that. I hope you're getting something good at it. If there's a topic that you would like me to cover, please put that in the comments. I would be more than happy for the ideas and the inspiration. But yeah, thanks very much for coming around. I'm always happy to have you here, and I'll see you next time. All right? Stay well.